Hi and welcome to Retro Decade, where today we're going to be doing a fix and restoration on this M80c Super Nintendo store kiosk. First off, I'd like to thank Jake Langer for letting me work on his kiosk. It's a beautiful piece of retro history, but unfortunately it does have some problems, and that's what we're here to fix today. I'd also like to thank you for joining me in this first video on this channel. If you see anything that you don't like or you think I could do better, please leave some constructive criticism in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and put the bell on so that you can see when I release more videos in the future. Let's start off by taking a look at the symptoms. As you can see, the screen is very bluish and just all around dark. I've looked into this a lot online, and it seems like there's a common problem with capacitors inside of a SCART cable. You'll see what that is shortly. Hopefully that's the case, as I really don't want to have to dig into the monitor unless it's an absolute must. If you're familiar with Occam's razor, you'll know that the simplest answer can sometimes be the best. So I went ahead and tried to mess with the contrast and brightness. No such luck today, that would have been way too simple. After removing the monitor, I found 4 screws under here, which required a 3mm Allen head wrench. While I like the way that this one folds out, it wasn't anywhere near long enough, so I'd recommend something that has a screwdriver handle. Something I found really interesting is that the monitor is actually held on by Velcro. This piece really needs repainted, but for the moment we're going to leave that alone because it's not what we're here for, and I don't have any Velcro to replace it with. And so now it's time to finally open this thing up. Whew! Man, it is dirty. I'm definitely going to take some time cleaning this out for Jake. Just for your entertainment, here's some photos of the carnage. Once inside, I found this mid-bass speaker, which works with 2 smaller speakers up near the fluorescent light. I also found what appears to be a fuse right here, so if you're troubleshooting one of these and you're getting no power, I'd recommend starting here. Next up is the ballast for the fluorescent light. I did find a fuse right here, so if you're having trouble with that light and replacing the bulb isn't working, check the fuse. Next up we have the Scart Connector, which if you're from North America and you have no clue what that is, don't worry, it's a European format. It's also where my research suggested that the problem is, so we'll be checking that in a moment. This main board here has several things that it does. It actually divides the audio signal out from the SCART connection and then transmits that to the 3 speakers, 2 up near the sign and this one here in the base. The video signal is sent out of this connector here to the monitor. It also has a relay on it that tells the fluorescent light ballast to turn on the light. And then lastly, there's an IC on the board that sends some sort of a signal out of this connector to the Super Nintendo that came with the kiosk. Without a signal from this, the Super Nintendo will not power on. Now, let's get a look inside of this SCART connector and see if that is where the problem's at. The board that this connector attaches to is rather flimsily placed, so I took a lot of extra care in removing it. To open a SCART connector, I just need to unscrew this part that's in my right hand. Once that's off, there's a little seam that runs along the back here. I used my fingernail to pry in between these 2 areas, and it came apart pretty much like a clamshell. And what do you know? There's the problem. As it turns out, these capacitors have been leaking, so that's likely our issue. Unfortunately, I failed to get a close-up photo of the damage before I did some cleaning, so our good friend Jeremy Weaver actually let me use this photo, which looks pretty much the exact same. And here's a photo of it after I cleaned it with rubbing alcohol and removed a lot of the corrosion. You can see that the traces are mostly bare now because of the acid eating away at the mask. You see, capacitors are a lot like batteries in that they have an electrolytic acid inside of them, and that does sometimes leak over time, and when it does, their values change, and the acid does a lot of damage to other components. So, to continue on trying to clean this up, I took some rubbing alcohol and a brush and I scrubbed, and scrubbed, and took a moment to spill some rubbing alcohol on myself, and then scrubbed some more. After ordering new capacitors and waiting a week, well, these finally came in. And, well, they seem a little bit taller than the old ones. Once I had my soldering iron out, my first priority was just to try to breathe some life back into these solder points. Unfortunately, they had a big layer of corrosion on all of them, and as you can see here, it just wasn't going well. So next I decided to try to add some flux, just to see if it would help eat at that corrosion. It helped a little, but not near as much as I'd hoped. To remove the capacitor, I first tried to use my finger to put sideways force on the capacitor while heating up one pad in the hopes that it would pull the leg out of the solder joint. It kind of worked, but not good enough. For corrosion removal, I found that the most useful method was to simply heat up the ball until I saw the liquid metal underneath melting, and then push the cap of corrosion off. After that, I could use desoldering wick to remove the solder from the solder joints. This is simply a braid of copper conductors braided much like you'd braid your hair, and after putting flux on it and applying heat, it will actually draw solder into it. Once the solder was removed, I had to use the soldering iron to gently pry the legs up as they were bent down. After that, I was able to fairly easily remove the old capacitor from the board. I followed that up with a thorough cleaning, again with rubbing alcohol, 90%, making sure to do the same on both sides. Now with capacitors, polarity is important, so this light colored side here is actually the negative. After inserting the leads through the holes, I tinned my soldering iron and added solder to both sides to firmly flood the pads with solder. I then trimmed the remaining leads away from the solder joints. Yeah, these new capacitors are definitely taller than the old ones. Hopefully that won't be a problem. I repeated basically the same process for the other 3 capacitors. Okay, now that I look at it, these are definitely a lot taller. I guess we'll see if we have fitment issues. Yeah, just as I suspected. This isn't going to be terribly easy. I'll take a look inside and see if I can identify the problem. So it turns out the leads that I clipped are still sticking out a bit too far, and my clippers are not really that accurate. I used my rotary tool, but I wouldn't recommend this as it does create a lot of little metal flakes. However, it does now close, so that's good. I'll just put it back together and run some tests. I was definitely happy to see it start up. However, something definitely still looked off with the hue. After first trying to adjust the brightness and contrast, I began to note that the areas that should be white were now purple. So back to this circuit board. What I began to notice is that these capacitors are no longer actually secure. It definitely should not be able to wiggle like this, and you can see the gap. That means it's not making contact. I suspect that this is due to the damage to the board as well as the pressure pushing down on these taller capacitors when they're put back together into the connector. Remember how I said earlier that the whites were purple? Well, when you think about it, a pixel only can show red, green, and blue. White is shown by all three being on. Red and blue only make purple, so we know that green was not making it to the screen. Now, in order to fix the lifted pads, what I'm going to do is scrape off the rest of this trace masking so we have nothing but bare copper. I'll go ahead and do this for all the traces, as I suspect this is going to be a problem with all three capacitors. To start, I applied pressure to the back of the capacitors to lift the pads as high as they'd go, and then remelted the solder so that it would be as close to the board as it could. Following that, I stripped some single conductor wire and then tinned it. I attached it to one of the solder balls, and then snipped it off around the same length as the trace. After that, I bent it down flat to the trace. The process that followed was basically to flood the trace with solder and bury that conductor onto the trace as extra structural support. This created a direct connection between the solder joint and the trace. For traces that were too short for the conductor, I just flooded them with solder to create a mechanical connection. I repeated the same for all the other traces. While my camera's not doing a very good job of picking it up, it works. So now we've just got to get everything back together so we can do our final testing. Phew, that definitely took a while. But with that, we get to wrap up this video and wrap up this fix and restoration. The colors are definitely much more vibrant than they were before, and all appear to be present. And while there's a number of things in this video that I would probably do different if I did it again, be sure to like this video and subscribe for sure so you can see what I do better next time. For any of you that own an SNES kiosk such as this one, hopefully this has given you what you need to make sure it's in tip-top shape. Be brave, be confident, you can figure it out. Until next time, thanks for watching.